Hey there, and welcome back. It's really nice to have you here again. Today's video dives into one of the most powerful and haunting stories in all of Greek mythology, the tragic tale of Oedipus, the king who tried to escape his destiny, but instead ran straight into it. A story filled with prophecy, mystery, fate, and the painful search for truth. Before we begin, please make sure to like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow and ensures you never miss a new mythological deep dive. And now, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive straight into this unforgettable story. Enjoy and have fun. A child marked by prophecy. In the ancient world of Greece, where the gods watched from their thrones on Mount Olympus, and the threads of human destiny were woven by the three fates themselves, there existed a fundamental belief that shaped every aspect of life. Fate was absolute, inescapable, and unchangeable. No mortal, no matter how powerful, how clever, or how determined, could alter what the gods had decreed. This belief was not merely philosophical speculation, but a lived reality, proven again and again by the tragic stories of those who tried to outrun their destinies, only to find themselves running directly into them. Among all these tales of unavoidable doom, none stands more prominent, more terrible, or more profoundly moving than the story of Oedipus, the king who was marked by prophecy from the moment of his birth, and whose every attempt to escape his fate only drew him closer to its fulfillment. The city of Thebes, where this tragedy unfolds, was one of the great centers of Greek civilization. Founded by the hero Cadmus and protected by mighty walls that had witnessed generations of glory and suffering. It was a place where the divine and mortal worlds intersected constantly, where oracles spoke with the voice of Apollo himself, and where the consequences of hubris and the weight of destiny pressed upon human shoulders with particular force. Into this world, into the royal palace of Thebes, a child was born who would become the ultimate embodiment of fate's inexorable power, a man whose intelligence and nobility would be turned against him by the very destiny he sought to avoid, and whose name would echo through the centuries as a warning about the limits of human agency and the terrible price of knowledge. This is the story of Oedipus, the king who killed his father, married his mother, and discovered that sometimes the greatest tragedy is not what we suffer, but what we unwittingly inflict upon ourselves and those we love. Part 1. The Prophecy of Doom. King Laius ruled Thebes with wisdom and authority, his power secured not just by his royal lineage, but by his marriage to Jocasta, a woman of noble birth and considerable intelligence, whose presence at his side strengthened his claim to the throne. For years, their reign was prosperous and their relationship loving, but there remained one shadow over their happiness. They had no children, no heir to secure the succession and carry the bloodline forward. In the ancient world, this was not merely a personal disappointment, but a matter of state importance, For a kingdom without a clear heir was a kingdom vulnerable to civil war and political chaos. As time passed and no child came, Laius grew increasingly troubled, and he made the decision that would set all subsequent tragedies in motion. He traveled to Delphi, the sacred site where Apollo's oracle spoke the will of the gods through the lips of the Pythia, the priestess who entered divine trances and channeled prophecies that were always true, though often cryptic and misleading in their wording. Laius came to Delphi with a simple question about his childless state, hoping perhaps for advice about sacrifices to make or rituals to perform that might grant him an heir. What he received instead was a prophecy so terrible that it would have been better never to have asked at all. The oracle spoke with the authority of the god himself, and her words were unambiguous and horrifying. If Laius and Jocasta were to have a son, that son was destined to kill his father and bring ruin upon the house of Thebes. There was no condition attached to this prophecy, no clause suggesting that certain actions might avert the doom, no hint that proper behavior or piety might change the outcome. The future was stated as absolute fact, as inevitable as the sunrise, and Laius returned to Thebes carrying this terrible knowledge like a wound in his heart. He shared the prophecy with Jocasta, and together they faced an impossible dilemma. They could choose to remain childless, to never consummate their union again, to accept that their line would end with them, and that the throne of Thebes would pass to other hands. This option preserved their lives, but condemned their legacy, and potentially exposed the kingdom to succession disputes. Or they could ignore the prophecy, choose to believe that divine warnings could be wrong or misinterpreted, that their love and care might somehow alter the course of fate, and proceed to have children despite the risk. For a time, they may have chosen the first path, but as months and years passed, the natural human desire for children, the political pressure for an heir, and perhaps a growing hope that the prophecy might not come to pass, led them to make the fateful decision. Jocasta became pregnant, and as her womb swelled with the child that would be Oedipus, both she and Laius must have felt the growing weight of the prophecy pressing upon them. Would they truly welcome this child into the world, knowing what had been foretold? Could parental love overcome the stark terror of the oracle's words? These questions would soon demand answers, and the answers they chose would determine not only their own fates, but the destinies of everyone connected to them.
Part 2. The Abandonment of the Infant. When Jocasta's labor pains began and the child was born, a son, as the prophecy had foretold, Laius faced the moment of decision he had been dreading. Looking upon the infant, he saw not just a helpless baby, but the instrument of his own future death, the one who would commit the unthinkable crime of patricide and bring destruction upon their house. The love that should have flooded his heart at the sight of his newborn son was poisoned by fear and the desperate desire to escape the fate the oracle had pronounced. Laius convinced himself that if the child died, if the subject of the prophecy was removed from the world before he could grow to manhood, then perhaps the prophecy itself would be rendered void. This was the logic of desperation, for it showed a fundamental misunderstanding of how divine prophecy worked in the Greek worldview. The gods did not predict what might happen, they declared what would happen, and their declarations were based on knowledge of a future that already existed in some timeless sense beyond mortal comprehension. But Laius, trapped between his terror and his hope, chose to act. He gave orders that the infant should be taken into the wilderness and killed, exposed on the mountainside to die from the elements or be devoured by wild animals, a method that would allow the parents to tell themselves that they had not directly murdered their own child, even as they ensured his death. To guarantee that even if the child somehow survived the exposure, he would not be able to walk and find his way back to civilization, Laius ordered that the baby's ankles be pierced and bound together with a metal pin or cord. This cruel act served both as a marker and as a crippling injury, and it gave the child the name by which he would be known throughout history, Oedipus, which in Greek means swollen foot, a constant reminder of the wound inflicted upon him by his own father. The task of carrying out this infanticide was given to a shepherd, a loyal servant of the royal household who was expected to follow his king's commands without question. But when the shepherd reached the lonely mountainside, when he held the crying infant in his arms and prepared to abandon him to certain death, something in his heart rebelled. Perhaps it was simple human compassion, the inability to murder a helpless baby no matter what orders he had been given. Perhaps he thought of his own children and could not bear to inflict such suffering. Or perhaps he sensed, in some intuitive way, that this child was marked by the gods for a purpose that should not be thwarted even by a king's command. Whatever his reasoning, the shepherd could not bring himself to leave the baby to die. Instead, he encountered or sought out a servant from Corinth, a city far enough from Thebes that no connection would be suspected, and he gave the child to the stranger, begging him to take the baby far away and find him a home. The Corinthian servant, moved by the same compassion, or perhaps seeing an opportunity to gain favor with his own master, carried the infant back to Corinth and presented him to King Polybus and Queen Merope, the rulers of that city who had no children of their own and longed for an heir. They received the baby with joy, asked no inconvenient questions about his origins beyond accepting the story that he was a foundling, and raised him as their own son, as the prince of Corinth who would one day inherit the throne. They named him Oedipus because of the distinctive scarring on his ankles, never knowing that this name connected him to the parents who had ordered his death. And so, in their very attempt to thwart the prophecy, Laius and Jocasta had set in motion the exact sequence of events that would bring it to fulfillment. If they had kept the child and raised him with full knowledge of the prophecy, if they had taught him from birth about the danger and taken precautions to prevent the foretold crimes, perhaps the outcome might have been different. But by sending him away, by ensuring that he would grow up not knowing who his true parents were, they guaranteed that when he eventually encountered Laius on the road, he would not recognize his own father, and when he was offered Jocasta's hand in marriage, he would have no idea he was marrying his mother. The prophecy would come true precisely because they had tried to prevent it. An irony that lies at the heart of tragic fate.
Part 3. The Suspicion and the Oracle. Oedipus grew to manhood in Corinth, raised as the beloved prince and heir to the throne, educated in all the arts befitting his station, trained in athletics and warfare, schooled in philosophy and rhetoric. He was by all accounts a remarkable young man, intelligent, physically strong, confident in his identity as the Prince of Corinth and the son of Polybus and Merope. His childhood was happy, his future seemed secure, and he had no reason to question the life that had been given to him. But during a feast, perhaps when wine had loosened tongues and lowered inhibitions, a drunk man made a casual comment that would shatter Oedipus's entire sense of self. The details vary in different versions of the story, but the essence is that someone, whether from malice or mere thoughtlessness, suggested that Oedipus was not really the son of the king and queen, that he was adopted or a foundling, that the royal blood he took such pride in was not actually his. The comment may have been meant as nothing more than the kind of cruel jest that emerges in drunken revelry, but it struck Oedipus with the force of a physical blow. Suddenly, everything about his life seemed uncertain. He looked at his parents with new eyes, searching for resemblances he had always assumed were there, and perhaps finding that he looked nothing like them. He remembered small comments or moments from his childhood that now seemed suspicious. The more he thought about it, the more the doubt grew, until it consumed him entirely. He confronted Polybus and Merope directly, demanding to know the truth about his birth, but they denied the accusation, insisted that he was their natural son, and were clearly hurt by his suspicions. But their denials, however sincere, could not fully erase the doubt that had been planted in his mind. Oedipus decided that there was only one way to know the truth with absolute certainty. He would travel to Delphi and consult the oracle of Apollo himself, for the gods knew all things, and their oracle would not lie. He made the long journey to the sacred site, climbed the slopes of Mount Parnassus to where the temple stood, and finally stood before the Pythia to ask his question: who were his true parents? But the oracle, speaking with the voice of Apollo, did not answer the question he had asked. Instead, the priestess delivered a prophecy that was both different from and eerily similar to the one that had been given to Laius years before. She told Oedipus that he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother, that he would commit the most terrible crimes imaginable, that his life would be marked by unspeakable pollution and horror. She gave no information about his parentage, offered no clarification about whether Polybus and Merope were his true parents or not, simply stated the terrible fate that awaited him as though it were already accomplished fact. Oedipus was horrified beyond measure. If the prophecy was true, and oracles were always true even when their meaning was unclear, then his very existence was a threat to those he loved most. He could not imagine deliberately harming Polybus, the man who had raised him with such care, or marrying Merope, the woman he thought of as his mother. The prophecy seemed impossible, unthinkable, yet the oracle had spoken it with absolute authority. Oedipus made an immediate decision based on what seemed like impeccable logic. If he was destined to kill his father and marry his mother, and if Polybus and Merope were his parents, then the only way to prevent the prophecy from coming true was to never return to Corinth. If he stayed far away from them for the rest of his life, if he ensured that he could never encounter Polybus in a situation where violence might occur, or find himself in circumstances where marriage to Merope might somehow be arranged, then surely he could outwit the fate that had been pronounced. It never occurred to him that the very act of fleeing from Corinth, of separating himself from the people he believed were his parents, was exactly what was necessary for the prophecy to be fulfilled. If Polybus and Merope were not his true parents, as the drunk man at the feast had suggested, then staying away from Corinth would not protect his real father at all. But Oedipus, like his biological father Laius before him, was trying to use logic and action to escape fate, not understanding that fate works precisely through such attempts at escape. And so he left Delphi not toward Corinth, but in the opposite direction, toward Thebes, toward the city where his true parents lived, toward the exact place where every element of the prophecy would come true.
Part 4. The Fatal Encounter at the Crossroads. The road from Delphi was narrow in places, winding through mountainous terrain, and at certain points barely wide enough for a single cart to pass.
Oedipus walked this road with his mind churning, processing the horror of the oracle's prophecy, grieving for the life in Corinth that he had voluntarily given up, and trying to plan what he would do with the rest of his existence now that he was essentially an exile by his own choice. He was young, strong, talented, and he would find a new place for himself in the world. But in that moment, he was simply a confused and frightened young man trying to make sense of a fate he could not understand. As he traveled, he came to a place where three roads met, a crossroads that would become infamous in Greek tragedy. From one direction came a small royal party, a chariot carrying an elderly man of obvious importance, accompanied by several attendants and heralds on foot. The precise details of what happened next vary slightly in different ancient sources, but the essential facts are clear. The royal party, accustomed to deference from common travelers and not recognizing Oedipus as anyone of importance, ordered him to get out of the way. The heralds may have struck him or shoved him roughly aside. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and the situation escalated rapidly. The elderly man in the chariot, angered by what he perceived as insolence from a young traveler, struck Oedipus with his staff or his goad. Oedipus, already emotionally volatile from the oracle's prophecy, filled with fear and confusion and a desperate need to assert some control over his life, reacted with explosive violence. He fought back against the entire party, and in the fury of the combat, he killed them all. The attendants, the heralds, and most importantly, the elderly man in the chariot. Only one member of the party escaped, fleeing back toward Thebes to bring news of the attack. Oedipus, standing amid the bodies, breathing hard from the exertion of the fight, may have felt justified in his actions. He had been attacked first, he had defended himself, and the law of self-defense was recognized even in the ancient world. He did not know, could not have known, that the elderly man he had just killed was King Laius of Thebes, his own biological father, and that the prophecy he was trying so desperately to avoid had just been half fulfilled. The tragic irony is overwhelming. Oedipus fled from Corinth to avoid killing Polybus, and in doing so he created the exact circumstances that led him to kill his actual father. If he had stayed in Corinth, he would never have been on that road at that time, would never have encountered Laius, and the prophecy could not have been fulfilled in that particular way. But by trying to escape his fate, he ran directly into it, proving the Greek belief that destiny cannot be avoided no matter what actions we take. The violence at the crossroads was not premeditated murder, but a spontaneous fight born of anger and pride, yet it accomplished what the prophecy had foretold just as certainly as if Oedipus had deliberately planned his father's death. After the fight, Oedipus continued on his journey, perhaps troubled by the violence, but not seeing it as particularly significant. Fights on the road were not uncommon in the ancient world, and he had no way of knowing the identity of the man he had killed. He did not return to check the bodies, did not learn that one of them was a king, and certainly did not connect this random encounter to the prophecy that haunted him. He simply continued walking toward Thebes, toward the city where the second half of the prophecy awaited him, toward the mother he did not know and the throne that would be offered to him as a reward for a heroism he had not yet performed. Part 5. The Sphinx and the Riddle. As Oedipus approached Thebes, he found a city in the grip of terror and despair. The roads leading to the city were empty of normal traffic. The countryside seemed abandoned, and an atmosphere of dread hung over everything. The cause of this terror was a monster, a creature of nightmare that had taken up residence just outside the city walls and was systematically destroying the population of Thebes. This was the Sphinx, a being with the body of a lion, the wings of a great bird, and the head of a woman, sent by the gods, some said by Hera herself, to punish Thebes for ancient crimes. The Sphinx had positioned herself on a high rock or outcropping along the main road into the city, and she stopped every traveler who tried to pass. She would pose a riddle, and if the traveler could not answer correctly, she would devour them on the spot, her leonine jaws tearing them apart while her human face watched with cold intelligence. Traveler after traveler had tried to pass, and traveler after traveler had died, their remains decorating the approach to the city as a warning and a testament to the Sphinx's power. The people of Thebes were trapped, unable to leave or enter their own city without facing the deadly creature. Their economy collapsing, their food supplies dwindling, their hope dying along with each failed challenger. King Laius had left Thebes some time before to consult the oracle at Delphi about how to deal with the Sphinx, and he had not returned. His failure to come back was attributed to the dangers of travel, or perhaps to the Sphinx herself, but no one yet knew that he had been killed at a crossroads by a young stranger. In the king's absence, the city was ruled by Creon, Jocasta's brother, who served as regent and who was desperate to find some solution to the crisis. When Oedipus arrived and learned of the Sphinx and her riddle, he saw an opportunity. Here was a challenge that relied not on birth or royal status, but on intelligence and courage, qualities he possessed in abundance. If he could defeat the Sphinx, he would not only save the city, but establish himself as a hero, earning a place in this new world he was trying to build for himself far from Corinth. He approached the Sphinx deliberately, ignoring the warnings of the few Thebans who saw him and tried to turn him back. The monster regarded him from her perch, her human face beautiful and terrible, her lion body coiled with predatory readiness, her wings shifting in anticipation of another meal. She posed her riddle, the same riddle she had asked all the others. What creature walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? This riddle had stumped every previous challenger, perhaps because they were too frightened to think clearly, perhaps because they tried to imagine literal creatures rather than thinking metaphorically. But Oedipus, whose intelligence was his defining characteristic, saw through the riddle immediately. He answered confidently, "Man. As an infant, he crawls on 4 limbs. As an adult, he walks upright on 2 legs, and in old age he uses a cane making 3 legs." The answer was correct, and the Sphinx knew it immediately. According to the prophecy or curse that governed her existence, she could only remain in the world as long as her riddle remained unsolved. The moment someone answered correctly, her purpose was fulfilled and her life was forfeit. In some versions, she let out a terrible shriek of rage and frustration. In others, she simply accepted her fate with the same cold intelligence she had shown in killing so many travelers. But in all versions, the result was the same. The Sphinx destroyed herself, either leaping from her rock to dash herself on the stones below or vanishing in some other way. Her reign of terror ended by a young man's intelligence. The road to Thebes was open once more. Part 6. The Marriage That Should Never Have Been. News of the Sphinx's defeat spread through Thebes like wildfire, transforming the atmosphere from one of despair to one of wild celebration. The monster that had held them hostage was gone, killed not by an army or a hero of established reputation, but by a stranger, a young man who had appeared as if sent by the gods themselves to save them. The citizens poured out of the city gates to welcome their savior, and Oedipus was carried into Thebes on a wave of gratitude and joy. Creon, as regent, knew that the city needed more than just relief from the immediate crisis. It needed stability, continuity, and legitimate rule. The king was dead, killed by bandits on the road if the story told by the sole survivor of that encounter was to be believed, and the throne was technically vacant. Creon himself could have claimed it as the brother of the queen and the regent who had held the city together during its darkest time, but he was wise enough to know that such a claim might be contested and might lead to civil strife. Moreover, he may have genuinely believed that the man who had saved Thebes from the Sphinx was marked by the gods for greatness, that divine providence had sent Oedipus to them for a purpose. And so, following what seemed like impeccable political and practical logic, Creon offered Oedipus both the throne of Thebes and the hand of Queen Jocasta in marriage. This was not an unusual arrangement in the ancient world. Queens often married the new king to provide continuity and legitimacy to the succession. And Jocasta herself was still young enough to bear children who would secure the royal line. From Oedipus's perspective, the offer must have seemed like a miraculous gift from the gods. He had left Corinth as a voluntary exile, uncertain of his future, haunted by a terrible prophecy, and now he was being offered a kingdom, a throne, and a queen. Jocasta was older than him, but she was still beautiful, intelligent, and politically sophisticated. There was no romantic courtship between them, no long period of falling in love. This was a political marriage arranged for the good of the state. But over time, genuine affection seems to have grown between them, and they settled into their roles as king and queen with every appearance of contentment. Oedipus ruled Thebes wisely and well, using the same intelligence that had defeated the Sphinx to address the problems of government, justice, and administration. The city prospered under his leadership, recovering from the crisis of the Sphinx and entering a new period of stability and growth. And Jocasta bore him children, 4 in total, 2 sons, Eteocles and Polynices, and 2 daughters, Antigone and Ismene. These children were the fruit of the incestuous union prophesied by the oracle, though no one involved knew it. They were simultaneously Oedipus's children and his siblings, their family tree twisted into an impossible configuration by the fulfilled prophecy. For years, perhaps even decades, Oedipus lived in complete ignorance of what he had done. He believed he had successfully escaped the fate proclaimed at Delphi. He had not returned to Corinth, and therefore he thought he had not killed his father or married his mother. The encounter at the Crossroads was forgotten or dismissed as unimportant. His marriage to Jocasta seemed perfectly normal, a political arrangement that had evolved into genuine partnership and affection. His children were the pride of his life, the guarantee of the dynasty's continuation. He had everything a man could want: power, respect, family, accomplishment, and the satisfaction of having saved his adopted city from destruction. But all of this happiness, all of this success, was built on ignorance, on not knowing the truth about who he was and what he had done. The prophecy had been fulfilled completely, every word of it, but Oedipus remained blind to this fact, unable to see the reality that would eventually destroy him. This blindness was not just metaphorical, but deeply ironic, for Oedipus prided himself on his ability to see truth, to solve riddles, to understand what others could not. He had been the one person clever enough to answer the Sphinx, yet he could not see the answer to the riddle of his own life. And this blindness, this inability to see what should have been obvious, would become literal before his story reached its terrible conclusion.
Part 7. The Plague and the Search for Truth. After years of prosperity and peace, disaster struck Thebes once more, this time in the form of a terrible plague. The sickness spread through the population with terrifying speed, killing the young and old, the strong and weak, sparing no household, regardless of rank or wealth. But the plague was not merely a disease of human beings. It affected everything in the city. The crops in the fields withered and died before they could be harvested. The livestock sickened and perished. Women who became pregnant suffered miscarriages or gave birth to stillborn children. The city that had flourished under Oedipus's rule was dying, and no natural explanation could account for the comprehensive nature of the disaster. In the ancient Greek worldview, Such afflictions were never merely random natural events, but signs of divine displeasure, indications that something was fundamentally wrong in the moral or spiritual order of the city. The gods were angry, and they were punishing Thebes collectively for some crime or pollution that had not been properly addressed. Oedipus, as king, and as the man who had once before saved the city from the Sphinx, took personal responsibility for finding a solution. He sent Creon, his brother-in-law and trusted advisor, to Delphi to consult the oracle and learn what the gods required to lift the plague. When Creon returned, he brought news that was both clarifying and troubling. The oracle had spoken clearly. The plague afflicting Thebes was a punishment for harboring a murderer, specifically the murderer of King Laius. The gods demanded justice for this unsolved crime. The killer of Laius still lived in Thebes, walking among the citizens as though innocent, and his presence polluted the entire city, bringing down divine wrath upon guilty and innocent alike. The plague would continue until the murderer was found and punished, either through exile or execution. This pronouncement gave Oedipus both a clear task and a personal mission. He had not known Laius personally, having only arrived in Thebes after the king's death, but as the current king, and as someone who took his responsibilities to his adopted city seriously, he vowed to hunt down the killer. He issued proclamations throughout Thebes demanding that anyone with knowledge of Laius's death come forward. He promised protection to anyone who provided information and threatened terrible punishment for anyone who sheltered or protected the murderer. He called down curses on the killer himself, declaring that this person would be exiled from the city, denied all the rights and protections of citizenship, and cut off from all human fellowship. The curses Oedipus pronounced were comprehensive and terrible, covering every aspect of life, and they were spoken with the full authority of his kingship and his genuine moral outrage at the crime. The irony, of course, though Oedipus did not know it, was that he was cursing himself, that every condemnation he spoke fell upon his own head, that he was hunting for a murderer who was no stranger lurking in the shadows, but the king himself. He was simultaneously the detective and the criminal, the judge and the condemned, the one who sought truth and the truth that was being sought. This terrible irony would have been clear to the original Greek audience watching the tragedy unfold, for they knew the story and could see what Oedipus could not, that every step he took toward solving the mystery of Laius's murder was a step toward his own destruction, that his intelligence and determination, the very qualities that made him a great king, were now turned against him, and that the truth he sought so diligently would be the instrument of his downfall.
Part 8. The Blind Prophet Tiresias. In his investigation, Oedipus decided to consult Tiresias, the ancient blind prophet who possessed divine sight, who could see the past, present, and future with perfect clarity, even though his physical eyes were sightless. Tiresias was one of the most revered figures in Thebes, a man who had lived for generations, whose prophecies were always true, and who spoke with the authority of the gods themselves. Oedipus summoned him to the palace and asked him directly to use his prophetic powers to identify Laius's killer. The old prophet came reluctantly, and when he stood before the king, he showed an unusual hesitation, a clear reluctance to speak. Oedipus pressed him, demanded that he reveal what he knew, insisted that the prophet had a duty to help save the city from the plague. But Tiresias resisted, and his resistance only grew stronger
as Oedipus became more insistent. Finally, the old man spoke words that should have been unmistakable. "You are the pollution. You are the murderer you seek. The killer of Laius stands before me, asking me to identify him." The truth was spoken clearly, without riddles or ambiguity, but Oedipus refused to hear it. Instead of recognizing the truth in Tiresias's words, instead of even considering the possibility that the prophet might be correct, Oedipus reacted with anger and accusations. He accused Tiresias of being part of a conspiracy, suggested that Creon had put the old prophet up to this false accusation as part of a plot to seize the throne. He attacked Tiresias personally, making cruel remarks about his blindness, suggesting that a man who could not see with his physical eyes should not claim to have divine sight. Oedipus's reaction reveals the psychological mechanisms that would keep him from seeing the truth even when it was placed directly before him. He could not conceive that he might be the murderer, because he had no memory of killing a king, because the idea contradicted his entire self-image as a savior of the city and a righteous ruler. It was easier to believe in an elaborate conspiracy than to consider that the prophet might be telling the truth. Tiresias, angered by Oedipus's accusations and insults, responded with prophecies that became increasingly specific and disturbing. He told Oedipus that the man he sought was both a native Theban and a foreigner, that this man had children with his own mother, that he was both brother and father to his own children, both son and husband to his wife. These statements were so bizarre, so seemingly impossible, that Oedipus dismissed them as the ravings of a senile old man, or as deliberate lies meant to confuse the issue. But every word was literally true, and the audience watching the tragedy unfold would have understood this while Oedipus remained blind. The confrontation between Oedipus and Tiresias represents one of the central ironies of the play. The physically blind prophet would see the truth clearly, while the sighted king was blind to reality. When Tiresias finally left, frustrated and angry at Oedipus's refusal to hear the truth, the king turned his suspicions toward Creon, convinced that his brother-in-law was plotting against him, using false prophecies to undermine his rule. The tension in the palace rose dramatically, and what had begun as an investigation into an old murder was becoming a political crisis that threatened to tear the royal family apart. But the truth, once set in motion, could not be stopped, and other witnesses and evidence would soon emerge to support everything Tiresias had said.
Part 9. Jocasta's fearful realization. Jocasta, hearing the conflict between her husband and her brother, tried to intervene and calm the situation. She entered the confrontation between Oedipus and Creon, trying to play the role of peacemaker, urging both men to set aside their anger and suspicions, to reassure Oedipus that prophecies were not always reliable, that seers could be wrong and should not be trusted absolutely. She told him a story that she thought would comfort him, but which instead would begin the unraveling of everything. She told him about the prophecy that had been given to Laius years ago, the oracle that said their son would kill his father. She explained how they had tried to prevent this by having the baby killed, how the infant had been taken to the mountainside with his ankles pierced and bound, how they had believed they had thwarted fate. And then she added, as proof that the prophecy had been false, that Laius had not been killed by his son, but by bandits at a place where 3 roads met, on his way to Delphi. This detail, meant to be reassuring, struck Oedipus with the force of a physical blow. A place where 3 roads met. He remembered the Crossroads, remembered the fight with the royal party, remembered killing the old man in the chariot. He began to ask questions, his voice probably shaking, demanding details about when this had happened, what Laius looked like, how many people were with him, whether anyone had survived. Each answer from Jocasta aligned perfectly with his memories of that day, and the horrible suspicion began to grow in his mind that perhaps he had killed Laius, that perhaps he was the source of the pollution in the city, that perhaps he had been cursing himself. But even at this point, he did not make the full connection. He was beginning to fear that he might be Laius's killer, but he still did not realize that Laius was his father, still did not understand that he had fulfilled the first part of the prophecy. He remembered the oracle at Delphi that had sent him fleeing from Corinth, the prophecy that he would kill his father. And he thought that perhaps he had killed Laius, believing him to be a stranger. But if Polybus and Merope were still alive in Corinth, then surely the prophecy had not been fully fulfilled. Jocasta, meanwhile, was beginning to experience her own terrible suspicions. As Oedipus asked his questions about the abandoned baby, about the pierced ankles, about the timing of everything, pieces began falling into place in her mind. She looked at her husband, this man she had lived with for years, this father of her children, and she began to see him not just as Oedipus the king, but as the baby she had sent to die on the mountainside. The scar on his ankles, which she must have noticed but never questioned, suddenly took on horrific significance. The timing of his arrival in Thebes, right after Laius's death, was no longer mere coincidence. The age difference between them, which had always been present but unremarkable in a political marriage, became evidence of something unspeakable. She realized the truth before Oedipus did, and the horror of that realization was total and immediate. She had married her own son. She had borne children to him. The prophecy had come true despite everything they had done to prevent it, or rather, because of what they had done. Her attempt to kill her infant son had sent him away where he grew up not knowing his parentage, and this ignorance had made the prophecy's fulfillment possible. Every decision made to avoid fate had brought fate closer. Jocasta tried to stop Oedipus from investigating further, begged him to let the matter rest, to accept that some things should not be known, that seeking this particular truth would bring only destruction. Her pleas were desperate and increasingly frantic, but she could not tell him directly what she had realized without confirming the horror. And perhaps some part of her hoped that if the words were never spoken aloud, if the truth was never fully articulated, it might somehow remain unreal. But Oedipus, hearing her begging him to stop the investigation, interpreted it as concern for his social status. He thought she was worried that he might turn out to be of low birth, that he might be the son of slaves or peasants, rather than the noble lineage he had claimed. His pride made him insist that he would pursue the truth regardless of what it might reveal about his origins, that he would rather know the truth, even if it was shameful, than live in ignorance. This misunderstanding of her motives drove him to continue the investigation even more determinedly, while Jocasta, realizing that the truth could not be stopped, fled from the room in anguish, knowing what was coming, but powerless to prevent it.
Part 10. The Shepherd's Revelation. The investigation now focused on finding witnesses who could definitively identify what had happened at the Crossroads, and, separately, on learning the truth about Oedipus's birth. A messenger arrived from Corinth, bringing news that seemed at first to be a relief. Polybus, the king of Corinth, whom Oedipus believed to be his father, had died of natural causes, of old age. This meant that the prophecy could not be fulfilled, or so Oedipus initially thought, because his father had died without him having killed him. The first part of the oracle's pronouncement seemed to have been proven false. But when Oedipus expressed relief and explained why he could never return to Corinth even now, the messenger, trying to be helpful and to ease the young man's fears, revealed a truth he thought would be comforting. Oedipus was not actually the biological son of Polybus and Merope. The messenger himself had been the one to bring the infant Oedipus to the Corinthian royal couple, having received him from a Theban shepherd on Mount Citaron. This revelation, meant to free Oedipus from his fear of the prophecy, instead opened up terrifying new questions. If Polybus was not his father, then who was? The investigation now turned to finding the Theban shepherd who had given the baby to the Corinthian messenger. This shepherd was located, brought to the palace, and questioned. He was reluctant to speak, clearly frightened and distressed, but under pressure from Oedipus and corroborated by the Corinthian messenger's testimony, the truth finally emerged. The shepherd admitted that he had been given a baby boy with pierced ankles by Jocasta herself, with orders from King Laius to expose the child and let it die. He admitted that he had been unable to carry out this order and had instead given the baby to the Corinthian. And when pressed to identify whose child it had been, he confirmed that it was the son of Laius and Jocasta, the prince of Thebes who had been condemned to death because of a prophecy. All the pieces came together in a single devastating moment. Oedipus understood everything. He was the son of Laius and Jocasta. He was the baby they tried to kill. He had grown up in Corinth not knowing his true parentage. He had killed Laius at the Crossroads, his own father, without recognizing him. He had married Jocasta, his own mother, and fathered children with her. Every word of the prophecy had come true. The man who had sought the pollution in the city had found it in himself. The curses he had pronounced on the murderer of Laius fell on his own head. The intelligence and determination he had used to solve the riddle of the Sphinx and to investigate the murder had led him to the most terrible knowledge any human being had ever possessed about themselves. Oedipus stood in the palace, surrounded by witnesses, the truth exposed before everyone, and the magnitude of what he had done, of what he was, crashed down upon him. He was not just a murderer, though that would have been terrible enough, but a patricide. He was not just a man who had married an older woman in a political arrangement, but someone who had committed incest with his own mother. His children were not just his sons and daughters, but also his siblings. Every natural relationship, every proper connection had been twisted and polluted beyond recognition. The prophecy had been fulfilled not despite his best efforts to avoid it, but because of those efforts, because every choice he made to escape his fate had been the exact choice necessary to bring it about.
Part 11. Jocasta's Death and Oedipus's Blindness. When the full truth was revealed in the palace, when Oedipus finally understood everything and cried out in anguish, Jocasta had already fled. She had known what was coming, had tried to prevent this moment, and when she realized that the truth could not be stopped, she returned to her private chambers, to the bedchamber where she had slept with Laius, where she had later slept with Oedipus, not knowing that they were father and son, where she had committed incest unknowingly, but no less truly for that lack of knowledge. The weight of what she had done, even though she had done it in ignorance, was more than she could bear. She had violated the most fundamental taboos of human society. She had fulfilled the prophecy that she had tried so desperately to avoid. She had borne children to her own son. There was no way to undo these things, no way to restore what had been shattered, no way to continue living with this knowledge. She took the belt or cord from her waist, fashioned it into a noose,
and hanged herself in that room that had witnessed so much unknowing horror. When Oedipus, in his anguish, sought her out, when he came to the bedchamber, hoping, perhaps, to share his grief with the one other person who fully understood the magnitude of what had happened, he found her body hanging there, lifeless, her face probably twisted in final despair. The sight broke something fundamental in him. His mother-wife was dead by her own hand, killed by knowledge just as surely as if the truth had been a blade. His children, his siblings, were orphaned and stained by the revelation of their impossible origins. The city he had saved and ruled was polluted by his presence. Everything he had built, every achievement, every moment of happiness was revealed as fundamentally false, built on ignorance of the most terrible truths. In his grief and his horror and his recognition of his own pollution, Oedipus made a decision about his own punishment. He took the golden brooches from Jocasta's robes, the decorative pins that had adorned her royal dress, and he used them to blind himself, driving them into his eyes repeatedly, destroying his sight with deliberate violence. This self-mutilation was deeply symbolic, representing multiple layers of meaning that would have been clear to the Greek audience. He had been blind to the truth despite his famous intelligence, blind to his own identity, blind to the reality of what he was doing. He had prided himself on his ability to see, to solve riddles, to understand what others could not. Yet he had been unable to see the most obvious truth about himself. Tiresias, the physically blind prophet, had seen clearly what Oedipus, with his working eyes, could not perceive. Now Oedipus made his metaphorical blindness literal, punishing the eyes that had looked upon his mother as a wife, that had watched his children, who were also his siblings, that had seen but not truly seen the reality of his existence. The blinding was also a rejection of the world itself. He declared that his eyes had seen what they should never have seen, that he could not bear to look upon his children or his parents in the afterlife, or upon any of the people of Thebes who had trusted him. The physical pain of the blinding was nothing compared to the psychological and spiritual agony he was experiencing, but at least it was pain he could control, pain he chose for himself, unlike the suffering that fate had imposed upon him unknowingly.
Part 12. Exile and the Weight of Fate. In the immediate aftermath of the revelations and Jocasta's death, the palace and the city of Thebes were thrown into chaos. The king who had saved them from the Sphinx, who had ruled them wisely for years, was revealed as the source of the pollution that had brought the plague upon them. The curses he had pronounced on Laius's murderer now applied to himself. Creon, who had been suspected of conspiracy, was vindicated and found himself thrust into power once again as the senior remaining member of the royal family. Oedipus, now blind and in the depths of despair, begged to be exiled from Thebes, to be cast out as he himself had decreed should happen to the murderer. He wanted to be sent away where he could not pollute the city any further, where his presence would not bring down further divine wrath upon innocent people. He asked that his children be cared for, particularly his daughters Antigone and Ismene, who would bear the stigma of their impossible parentage and whose marriage prospects were destroyed by the revelation of incest in their bloodline. Creon, perhaps out of genuine compassion or perhaps out of political calculation, did not immediately exile Oedipus, but consulted the oracle to determine what the gods required. The exile eventually happened, though different versions of the myth vary on the exact timing and circumstances. Oedipus left Thebes as a wandering beggar, accompanied eventually by his daughter Antigone, who served as his guide now that he was blind. He wandered the world as an outcast, rejected by every city he came to, carrying with him the burden of his impossible crimes and the knowledge that had destroyed him. His suffering was not just physical, though the life of a blind beggar was certainly harsh, but psychological and spiritual.
He had to live every day with the knowledge of what he had done, even though he had done it unknowingly. He had to grapple with the question of guilt. Was he truly guilty of crimes he committed in complete ignorance? The Greek world generally answered yes, that pollution was objective regardless of intent, that the violation of natural law was real whether or not the violator knew what they were doing. But Oedipus himself seems to have wrestled with this question, sometimes accepting his guilt and sometimes raging against the fate that had trapped him. His wandering eventually brought him to Colonus, a suburb of Athens, where the final chapter of his life unfolded. In this place, according to Sophocles' play Oedipus at Colonus, the aged and broken former king underwent a transformation. He was still polluted, still carrying the weight of his terrible actions, but he became in some sense sacred, a figure who had suffered beyond normal human limits and who therefore had a special connection to the divine. The gods, who had orchestrated his tragedy through their prophecies, now claimed him as their own. Various cities sought to possess his body after death because prophecy said that the land where Oedipus was buried would be blessed, showing that his pollution had somehow been transformed into sanctity through extreme suffering. In the grove at Colonus, Oedipus experienced his death not as an ordinary mortal end, but as a mysterious translation into some other state. Thunder sounded from the heavens, and Oedipus, led by divine signs, walked into a sacred grove from which he did not return in any normal sense. Only Theseus, the king of Athens, witnessed what happened, and he was sworn to secrecy about the exact nature of Oedipus's end. The man who had been the most polluted of mortals became a guardian spirit, a hero whose bones blessed the land that held them. This ending suggests a complex theology in which even the most terrible suffering and the most profound violations of natural law could be incorporated into a larger divine order, in which the extremity of human experience, even at its worst, created a kind of holiness.
A king who could not escape fate. The story of Oedipus stands as perhaps the most perfect embodiment of the ancient Greek understanding of fate, knowledge, and the limits of human agency. At every point in his life, Oedipus made rational decisions based on the information available to him. Yet these decisions led him inexorably toward the fulfillment of the prophecy he sought to avoid. When his parents tried to kill him as an infant to prevent the prophecy, they created the conditions necessary for it to come true. When Oedipus fled from Corinth to avoid killing the man he thought was his father, he placed himself on the road where he would encounter and kill his actual father. When he answered the Sphinx's riddle and saved Thebes, he earned the reward of marriage to his mother. Every act of agency, every exercise of free will served fate rather than opposing it. This paradox lies at the heart of Greek tragedy. Humans are agents who make meaningful choices, yet those choices are ultimately constrained by a larger pattern they cannot see or escape. The Greeks did not see this as a contradiction, but as a profound truth about the nature of existence. Oedipus's famous intelligence, his ability to solve riddles that defeated everyone else, becomes, in the context of the full story, a kind of tragic flaw. He could solve the Sphinx's riddle about the nature of man in general, but he could not solve the riddle of his own identity and origins. He could see patterns in external reality, but was blind to the truth of his own life. This blindness was not stupidity or lack of evidence, but something deeper, a fundamental inability or unwillingness to see what was too terrible to accept. When Tiresias told him directly that he was the killer he sought, Oedipus rejected this truth because it contradicted his self-image and seemed impossible. Only when evidence from multiple sources forced him to accept it did he finally see, and the seeing destroyed him. The theme of blindness and sight runs throughout the story with layered meanings. Tiresias was physically blind but possessed true sight. Oedipus had working eyes but was blind to the truth.
When Oedipus finally gained true knowledge, true sight into reality, he responded by blinding himself physically. This suggests that some truths are so terrible that sight itself becomes unbearable, that knowledge can be a curse rather than a blessing, and that the unexamined life, the life lived in ignorance, might in some ways be preferable to full awareness of certain realities. This is deeply disturbing to modern sensibilities that generally value knowledge as inherently good, but it reflects a Greek wisdom about the potential dangers of certain kinds of knowing. The question of guilt and innocence in Oedipus's story remains genuinely complicated. By any standard of intent or knowledge, Oedipus was innocent. He killed Laius not knowing he was his father. He married Jocasta not knowing she was his mother, and he lived for years with no awareness of his crimes. Yet from the Greek perspective of pollution and miasma, he was none the less guilty. His presence in this city brought plague, and he required purification through exile and suffering. This tension between subjective innocence and objective pollution, between the fact that he did not know and the fact that he did do these things, makes Oedipus's tragedy particularly poignant. He is simultaneously victim and perpetrator, innocent and guilty, the one who sought truth and the truth that was sought. The curse on his family, extending backward to his parents and forward to his children, reinforces the theme that individual actions have consequences beyond the individual, that we are embedded in families and communities, and that our choices affect others in ways we cannot fully control. Oedipus's sons would eventually kill each other in civil war over the throne of Thebes, and Antigone would die defending the principle of family duty against state authority, showing that the tragedy initiated by the prophecy to Laius continued to work itself out through multiple generations. The story ultimately stands as a meditation on the human condition, in a universe governed by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The gods in this story are not cruel for cruelty's sake, but they are not merciful either. They are simply other, operating by laws and purposes that mortals cannot fully understand. The prophecy was given not as a warning that could be heeded, but as a statement of what would be, and all attempts to change it only brought it closer. Oedipus's final transformation from the most polluted of men to a sacred guardian spirit suggests that extreme suffering can lead to a kind of transcendence, that the one who has lost everything and experienced the absolute limits of human tragedy may touch something beyond normal human experience. The legacy of Oedipus extends far beyond ancient Greek theater. His story has been retold, analyzed, and reinterpreted by every subsequent age, from Freud's use of the Oedipus complex to describe psychosexual development, to countless modern adaptations that use his story to explore themes of identity, knowledge, family, and fate. The reason the story endures is that it touches on fundamental human anxieties, the fear that we might unknowingly do terrible things, the fear that our attempts to avoid our fate might bring it about, the fear that our parents' sins might curse us, and the deep existential question of whether we are truly in control of our lives or merely acting out a script written by forces beyond our understanding. Oedipus remains the ultimate tragic hero, the man who had everything and lost it all, the solver of riddles who could not solve his own mystery until too late, the king who could not escape fate.
And that's it with this story about Oedipus, the king who tried to outrun his fate and uncovered the truth at a devastating cost. I really hope you enjoyed this journey into one of mythology's most powerful tragedies. If you liked the video, please drop a like and consider subscribing. It truly helps a lot. Thank you so much for watching. Take care, and bye-bye.